All right, I think that's kicked in. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Weaver, a humanities professor here at Forsyth Tech and the moderator for today's event. This afternoon's event is a part of Forsyth Tech's partnership with the Pulitzer Center that allows us to bring journalists to campus and sometimes virtually each spring and fall semester. Before we get to today's guest, I'd like to briefly speak with you about another aspect of our partnership with the Pulitzer Center, reporting fellowship. Are you interested in international travel? Are you unsure of how you would pay for it? Is there an issue that you are passionate about but feel like it doesn't get the attention that it deserves? If so, the Pulitzer Center will send one Forsyth Tech student anywhere in the world to research and report on any issue that you believe needs more attention. To be eligible for the fellowship, students must be 18 or older in 2023, or if you apply the next cycle in 2024, and enrolled during at least one semester of the 2022-2023 academic year. The next upcoming application deadline will be January 26th, 2023. So if you're interested, please get in touch with me as soon as possible so we can help you get the best application you can and have an outstanding shot at winning that fellowship. If you'd like to learn more about the fellowship programs, receive an application, or get on our mailing list, just email me. I'll post my email address and some information in the chat. We'll also be having a virtual information session about the fellowship program on Thursday, December 8th at 2 p.m. I'll also post that link in the chat. I'll also put my email and a link with further details on the fellowship program in the chat. It's an amazing opportunity, and I sincerely hope you will consider applying. I actually do have one more announcement from the Pulitzer Center before we get started. I just found out this week that there's another event that we've been invited to at noon tomorrow, Friday, November the 18th. There's going to be a virtual conversation with Roman Anin, and who's Russia's leading investigative journalist and founder of iStories, and Ukraine's top investigative reporter, Anna Barbanets, the co-founder of Slitstvo, I believe, .info. Both outlets are at the forefront of using digital tools and data to report on the atrocities of the war. If you're interested, please register in advance using the link that I will also put in the chat. There's no cost at all for attending this event. This rare public conversation between a Ukrainian and a Russian journalist who are leading investigative newsrooms in wartime should be both illuminating and inspiring. And so without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce today's speaker. And after that, I'll go ahead and post the information I was referring to in the chat. Brittany Gibson is a British-American journalist who's currently a politics reporter at Politico in Washington, D.C. She graduated with a BA and degrees in journalism and media studies and art history, and a minor in French language from Rutgers University. She has also studied at Paris 8 and John Cabot University in Rome. She was previously a writing fellow at the American Prospect magazine in Washington and interned with the New York Daily News and CNN International in London. Her work covers varying subjects and beats, but all her stories originate from an innate sense of curiosity about how the world works and a desire to share people's stories. Welcome, Brittany.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, let me just second any sessions at the Pulitzer Center you can attend, especially all the free ones, are well worth going. I go now even as a professional journalist just to hear from other peers and people in the profession. So I'm going to present for you guys about some reporting I did what feels like a million years ago at the beginning of 2020. I started my first job in Washington during the 2020 election cycle, moved into DC in 2019, not completely set on politics or campaigns reporting, but feeling very curious about how elections work and, how campaigns work, how this whole democratic process functions. And so, before that, obviously, a lot of people were shocked by the results of the 2016 election. Because I'm British as well, I also was paying close attention to the Brexit referendum in England. And then looking at the 2018 midterms, that was the first time I was, really thinking about terms like voter suppression and how that factored in to American elections. Everyone remembers, or you probably remember in 2018, videos, things on sharing on social, spreading on social media of, long lines at polling places, talk about, issues with voter IDs and, alternatives to in-person early voting. And you kind of have to put yourself, imagine early 2020, before COVID, before people were, really thinking about ballot procedures. I was kind of going into the 2020 election cycle with these questions and just being really curious, not just about not just about who was going to win the 2020 election, although obviously everyone was, but how does this election going to work, and how will this all function? So I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to break the first rule of PowerPoint presentations by showing you a screen with a lot of text, but forgive me. So this is a quote from Tori Wegner. She is a attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, focused on their voting rights work. And I'm breaking the rule of presentations because I feel like this quote really sums up how I went into the reporting, trying to balance what I was seeing on the ground at the time of the reporting. I was going to say today, but at the time of the reporting, and the history of democracy and voting in the United States. So Tori told me, we look with 2020 vision back at that time being Jim Crow, pre-Voting Rights Act, and see it as explicitly racist, as explicit tactics for disenfranchisement written into law in all of these different circumstances. We had explicit tactics then, and we have explicit tactics now, in that a literacy test was not necessarily putting race at the forefront, but we all know how it was used. Or there were laws about what qualifies you to vote or not. All of those tactics were administrative choices, and they weren't necessarily written around race, but they were the ends to the means that we know now. So you'll hear in my presentation a lot about communities of color, but you could extend this quote out to any vulnerable population, any vulnerable group, any group protected by the Voting Rights Act. And the reason I like this quote so much is because, I'm going into this as a journalist, and this quote reminds me that not everything is clear and cut and dry. And I'm probably never going to go into an interview with a politician or a lawmaker where they say outright, oh yeah, we passed this law, so XYZ demographic wouldn't vote. No one is ever going to say that, right out front. You've got to investigate. You've got to look at the law. You've got to look at impact. You've got to look at changes, and you've got to do the on-the-ground reporting. Just one piece of that on its own, just looking at one law on its own, won't show the whole story. And so that's what I attempted to do with this reporting, keep digging and find the story. So again, time travel with me to the South Carolina 2020 presidential primary. This is late February of 2020, again, pre-COVID. So still going to events and things like that. And South Carolina, I picked this state to go to first, partially just because of the presidential primary calendar. Another thing to keep in mind is doing this reporting, the primary calendar staggered. You can isolate one state at a time, or when it gets later, a handful of states at a time, but they still use those same rules, those same laws on the general election day when everyone votes at once. So South Carolina is the first in the South primary. It is one of the first primary states with that significant history of voter suppression in the US. And so that was my first stop. And it was a great way to lay out thinking of voting in kind of two paths. The first being in person on election day, the second being by mail. So focusing on in-person voting, the obstacles I was able to report on and was able to see, first was the issue of voter IDs. So the Brennan Center for Justice did a study that shows that in states with strict voter IDs, about 10% of people are not able to qualify for that driver's license or non-driver's license from the DMV. And that can be something as simple as, if you are an elderly Black person, born into a rural area in the South, it's possible you were born in an area with segregated hospitals, and you weren't born in a hospital and didn't have a birth certificate, or some other variation of that situation. And, it's something that I realized that I definitely take for granted. Having those underlying documents, having the ability to, take that for granted, even at 16, just getting my learner's permit.
Can I interrupt you
But
for a moment, Brittany?
yes.
Should there be something on the screen? Someone it says loading on our end.
Oh,
Does it
can
say
you
loading on
not
your
see
end
my
too? No.
presentation? Oh, I'm so sorry. It says I'm sharing my screen. Let me stop and try and share it again.
And we did see a screen that says loading and it had tabs open, but nothing was happening in the slideshow.
Okay, let me see. Exit. Ooh. Can you see a Google Doc screen?
I see a blank screen with a cursor moving on it, a black screen. Cursor.
Oh, that's so weird.
Interesting.
Hold on. Okay. Let me try again. I knew there'd be a technical difficulty.
I see something now. Election day in South
Yes.
Carolina?
Yes. Okay. Can you see the presentation now?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully it
Let
should
me
work.
go slideshow. What about now?
We're back to the loading screen that was on.
Oh, okay. And now can you see the
So
Google
yeah,
Google Slides?
yes.
Okay, then I will not put it into presentation mode. I'll just keep it like this if that's okay with you guys.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, yeah. No worries. Thank you so much for interrupting because I
Of
would not
course.
have known on my own at all. So this is my little South Carolina pick. Seeing all the names just teleports me. That helps everyone reorient yourself with 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago now. So IDs, one obstacle to voting in person that can affect about 1 in 10 people in states with that strict voter ID law. Another thing, I didn't focus on the state of Texas, but I thought this was just very interesting. Another way to look at voter ID laws is to look at what IDs are accepted. So in Texas, for example, you cannot use your university college ID, but you could use a gun license. So you think of all of the students in a state as big as Texas that leave home and get this ID from their university, are allowed to take out their student loans with this university, but can't use that same identification to then go register to vote and present it at the polls to vote. So that's just, I didn't focus on Texas, but that's one law that I like to share as well. Another one is long lines. And so long lines inherently are not, a burden on the right to vote, but you can, again, pulling back behind the surface, look at them in terms of the larger bureaucracy. So when you have long lines in areas because you don't have enough poll workers, because you don't have enough machines, because there are technical difficulties on the machines. And then when you can layer on top of that too, where in any given state are you getting long lines because of these bureaucratic, very simple, in a way, very boring election administration decisions. And, we found, especially in 2018, you look at a state like Georgia, the areas that were most impacted were the areas that were my majority minority areas, majority Black areas of the state. And those things can be corrected with bureaucratic decisions. It's a matter of whether or not the resources are there and the resources are allocated properly. And so on the flip side of that, if you're a voter, you kind of, you were probably not thinking about the bureaucratic decisions of your county or state board of elections. But if you're a working class person, if you're a person with, childcare responsibilities, care responsibilities in general, you might not be able to afford the time needed to wait in a line for those bureaucratic decisions to play out. And so that's how it can be a preventative or suppressive part of the in-person voting process. And that's all that before you get to the polls. The second avenue that I looked at, and South Carolina again was a great state to explore this issue, was voting absentee or voting by mail. And as a reporter, again, I was not from South Carolina. I flew into this state. I like to think of, some of the people that you meet and share their stories and issues with you as ambassadors. And when it came to absentee voting in South Carolina, my ambassador on this issue was this retired physician named Dr. Brenda C. Williams. She's this woman on the left here. And she took it upon herself to start a nonprofit in, I want to say, she was 2006 or 2007, just trying to help give back to her community by helping people vote. And a lot of that work she did through the absentee system, because then she could do it, the weeks leading up to an election, not just work on election day. And she reached out to low propensity voters, people in her community of Sumter, South Carolina, which was a very small town, maybe an hour outside of the capital, and helped them cast their ballot. And so the thing with absentee ballots in South Carolina, but also with many states in the US, I forget the exact number now, is that there's actually a bit of a checklist before you are able to submit your ballot. So first, you do your ballot requests in South Carolina, and then they mail your ballot, you fill it out. Then you put it in one envelope and you have to sign it. And while you do this process, you have to have a witness there watching you do it. And then that first envelope goes into a second envelope where the witness signs it, and then the witness puts their address. So you've got this 3-part checklist of your signature, your witness signature, and your witness address. And all 3 of those have to be there for your ballot to count. If you're missing one of those 3 things, depending on the county you live in, and just, if they have enough staff, if they have the time, they might be able to call you and say, hey, you forgot to sign, or your witness forgot to put their address down. Would you like to come down and cure it? But some counties, simply through there's no state law mandating that you call and help someone cure, and they might not have the staff, the time, the resources to do so. So what will happen then, if you're missing any one of those 3 things, is it's a little ironic. Your ballot goes into what they call an attention envelope, which means they do not pay attention to it and it's not counted in the election. So you can kind of see in these photos here. And if you ever have a photojournalist from the Pulitzer Center, do a presentation, you probably won't see photos of this quality, but bear with me on these ones. But you've got Queen Kennedy here, the woman that Dr. Williams helped vote when I was down there, on the left doing her signature on that first envelope. On the right, you've got Dr. Williams doing her signature and her address on that second envelope. And then I really like this photo. Again, you'll never see this if a professional photojournalist comes to give a presentation for you. But Dr. Williams is telling me, come closer. You can kind of see it with her hand in the photo. She's saying, Brittany, come closer, see every step, see every part of this process. And just as a reporter, that's what you need. And that's what you really want, especially on a reporting trip, but that extends out to any topic you're reporting on. You want your ambassador on the issue to show you as close to the ground level as possible on what you're reporting on. And that's really what Dr. Williams was for me, especially on the issue of absentee and mail-in voting in South Carolina. So then South Carolina primaries, we're moving on in the calendar. My next stop is to Selma, Alabama. And if you remember the quote from Tori, I'm trying to balance history with what I'm seeing in present day. And there was really no better group of people to be interviewing, to be aware of history in present day than the people at the Selma Jubilee. And this, I just got a little bit lucky. In between the South Carolina primary and Super Tuesday, when Alabama votes, was the Bloody Sunday or Remembrance March, the Jubilee event. So you had, I think it was 50,000 people. And again, like looking at this photo now, this is less than a month away from COVID lockdowns, we know now. But everyone here, from the speakers to the attendees, again, just very tuned into the history of voting rights in the United States, and very aware that following Tuesday there was going to be an election. And so I talked to as many people as I could, which was not too hard at such a crowded event. But one person that I spoke to was a woman named Derricka Green, lifelong Selma resident. I asked her, how many Jubilees have you been to? And she said she'd been going since before she could even walk and fully participate in them. And she went to university in a different part of Alabama. and, university, turned 18, wanted to vote. And she had an issue at her polling place where she was showing her home ID, her driver's license, but because it was a different area than where she was trying to vote, where she registered to vote, because of course it was her parents' address versus her school address, had to fill out a provisional ballot, had all that bureaucratic, difficulty at the polls. And this is how she described that experience. She said, "It was frustrating, but it was minute compared to what my grandmother and everybody else went through." And I just thought that was an incredible perspective. And looking back on my notes, as I'm writing up my stories and I'm finishing my reporting trip, I asked a lot of people in Selma if they felt like they'd experienced voter suppression. And they said no. But then I asked, well, have you ever gone to your polling place that you go to every year or every 2 years, and you get there and there's nothing happening and you have to quickly scramble to find out where the new place is? And people would say yes. Or I would ask about something similar to Derek Green's situation, where I'd say, did you have your driver's license and you were registered, but there was some sort of address mix up, and then you had to do a provisional ballot or you couldn't vote at all? And people would say yes. And so, getting more specific with each question, not just this broad term of voter suppression, really led to the most interesting stories in the reporting at that day on at the Jubilee. So that was just another little journalistic lesson that I learned, getting more specific, got the best stories that day. From Selma, I also wanted to head down. So Selma's kind of near Birmingham. I wanted to head down to Mobile, Alabama. Again, I was interested in the voter ID issue. And what was interesting about Alabama, it was actually a case from their state, from Shelby County, Alabama, that rolled back a provision in the Voting Rights Act that people can, still refer to as a major decision in that legislation. But that allowed Alabama to pass its voter ID law to begin with. But what Alabama's state government also did was they started closing down Department of Motor Vehicles offices, or drastically reducing their hours to the point where there was a study done in the majority minority, which was mostly majority Black counties in Alabama. They found that they had the most DMV closures compared to other parts of the state. So not only did you need your voter ID, need your ID to vote, your driver's license or non-driver's license to vote, but then they also made it more difficult to get that ID. And Mobile was one of the counties that was also majority minority, also impacted by this. The Justice Department actually later got involved and said you need to reopen some of these counties, or have some other alternatives to get IDs. But Mobile was also politically important because it's kind of a purple part of a red state that's got some blue pockets. So when Doug Jones won that 2017 Senate race against Roy Moore, Mobile County flipped to blue for him. So it can also be kind of politically important. And so, I've read all this background, and, I've, done the research, done the pre-reporting, talked to the national groups. But again, you want to get down to the, as close to the ground level, grassroots of this as possible. So I found, again, another ambassador to the issue in Alabama, or in Mobile, I should say. It was a man named Ben Harris. He was chairman of the Mobile County Democratic Executive Committee, which is just their local Democratic Party. And in Alabama, the local Democratic Party, he said his main job, his main work is voter education. Would you like to register? Do you know there's an election? It's very basic stuff down there. And he confirmed, what I had read and seen in the research, where he said, "We've got all the challenges you're reading about in Mobile. We've got them all," which I thought was a great way to, validate what I had read and, heard from other interviews, again, from someone who is an ambassador for me on the issue, right at the ground level. I did have the inverse experience, though, on my next stop, which was in St. Louis, Missouri. So I wanted to go to St. Louis. Again, I'm following the primary calendar. Alabama was Super Tuesday. This was the following Tuesday. And if you remember, the earlier stages of the Black Lives Matter movement. It started, or I shouldn't say started, but an earlier phase of it was in Ferguson, Missouri, which is it's the greater St. Louis area. And a lot of organizing, a lot of civil engagement, demonstrations, but organizing a little more broadly happened in that year and the years following the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And so I went in with this theory that where there's organizing, there will be voting. All of these activists and organizers, there had been some increased involvement in local elections, not dramatically, but I thought a presidential year, not the first, but one of the following of all the organizing of this movement, we're going to see huge turnout. We're going to see, people wanting to be involved and basically voting. I was like, organizing might lead to voting. And I had read some studies about obviously organizing in the past leading to voting, all that kind of stuff. So again, found another ambassador on this issue. At the time, just a candidate for Congress, Cori Bush, now is Representative Bush from Missouri's 1st District. And she was/is a pastor in the St. Louis area and was a Ferguson mobilizer, protester, demonstrator back from 2014. And I did a profile of her actually later in the election cycle where she said, she's, even when she's elected, consider her a protester. So that's kind of where she came from. Again, very close to that on the ground level. What I was reading, was what I was thinking accurate going into this? Was my research going to line up? And so again, I'm going to break the rules of PowerPoint presentations and give you this block of text. But basically, Cori Bush said, no, I don't think that's right. That's not what's happening here. What you're reading and what research shows isn't going to happen. So this is what she said when I was asking her about turnout ahead of the primary in 2020. There's still some level of trauma and pain there, seeing how our electeds didn't stand up for us, people losing jobs, people losing homes, people going to court and not having assistance, just so many things. There are still a lot of people that feel this thing, politics, is not for them. They're not there yet. It's going to take some time. Before Tuesday, the primary day, I would say no, increased turnout is not likely. And she was absolutely right. Looking back at the results, looking at the returns, there wasn't this increased turnout. That organizing did not translate to electoral politics. And that's important to know. And that's what I reported on. That's how I reported it out. But again, it just shows how important it is to have that ambassador, that on the ground person to tell you and show you what is happening. So this is a part of the presentation where I say, no one was really paying attention to, alternatives to voting and methods of voting. And the Pulitzer Center actually supported my reporting with a grant, because it was a bit of an underreported story at the beginning of 2020 to say, I want to report on how people vote and how this process works. And then came coronavirus and everyone was thinking about this, and you can't get less underreported than the president tweeting about what you're reporting on. So that's the position I was in for the rest of 2020. I stayed on this beat. I continued to report on how COVID was changing how people voted. And again, just the how of how our election system works. And so the first story I did in COVID, these are not Pulitzer Center stories, but just 2 other examples of what I continued doing, was this story in Wisconsin. This is April 8th, 2020. Wisconsin was the only state not to delay its presidential primary. I think they had a couple of other local elections on the ballot too that day. But in Milwaukee, where 90% of the Black population in Wisconsin lives, they went from, or maybe I should say the greater Milwaukee area, but in that part of the state, they went from 180 polling places on election day to 5. And that came from, again, that resource allocation from enough poll workers, enough people manning the machines. At this point during the pandemic too, it was all about PPE and, do we have enough masks to give out? Will everyone wear a mask? All this kind of stuff. But, going from 180 polling places to 5, you can imagine what the lines were like. you can imagine what the wait times were like, that kind of thing. And so one person I talked to, a Milwaukee voter named Lakeisha Wilder, she summed up that election this way. She said, they know if we are forced to go out and vote in this environment, either we won't go, which is clearly disenfranchising people from voting, or if we do go, we're putting ourselves in mortal danger. So the GOP, the court who overturned our final decision to not hold this in-person election, completely screwed us. And yeah, if you just remember where we were, early April of COVID, mortal danger was definitely how it felt like. And, her relationship to her local officials at that time was feeling completely screwed. And I thought that was just a great way to sum up how she felt. The next story the next example I'll show you, not the next story I did, this one's in June, but it was about New York City and New York State, I should say. New York is not a state that comes to mind when people think about voter suppression, but it is actually, up until 2018, the only options for in-person voting were on election day in New York. And it was one of those states where, again, you had to do a request for an absentee ballot and then get the ballot and then send it back. There was more steps to that process than others. So it was really, in terms of options to voting, on the more restrictive side. And it's a little bit left out of the conversation because it's, not a southern state. It's not thought of in that historical way. But New York, because of its past, how people had voted mostly on election day in person, during COVID had to do a total overhaul of their voting options, especially for people in New York City, obviously a densely populated area during COVID. And they worked out how to do their mail-in ballots. But for people with disabilities that, were requesting their ballots over an email system and then getting them emailed back to them, what they would have to do is, print it out and send it back to the office like everyone else after that point. But when they designed the printout for the ballot, they designed it on legal sized paper. In June of 2024, I didn't even own a printer. Of June 24th of 2020, I didn't even own a printer in my house yet, let alone have legal size paper to print out a ballot. And so, just again, kind of a bureaucratic design oversight, not thinking of, well, how is a voter going to print this out on legal size paper? And so I talked to a voter who was blind and was trying to be able to print out her ballot and reformat and resize her ballot on legal size paper while also not being able to see what comes out. So she was using her assistive technology to try and rescan what she had printed and try and troubleshoot. She was also an elderly voter and was not able to make that process work because of this design oversight, and ended up having to go vote in person for the New York primary. So her name was Eva Burgess, and this is how she put it. She said, if you get all the way through that request system, voting, printing it out, and the only thing that messes you up is printing the damn thing out to be able to send it off, that's horrible. I cannot explain to you how horrible that is. And again, just a very emotional and succinct way to sum up her voting experience. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and take any questions you guys may have. Anything on the presentation and voting rights, voting laws, or journalism, my career in general.
And if you would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. If you'd prefer that I read a question, you can type it in the chat and I'd be happy to ask. And then just please remute yourself if you do want to ask. Or after you're done asking, I should say.
Hello, we're for Tech's Journalism Club. We're responsible for putting out, technically speaking, our newspaper every month. It's fantastic to see someone in the industry doing what we all love. We're all young, budding journalists, so we're trying to get into that world. I had a question particularly about when you were going out and kind of getting into that guerrilla style journalism. like amongst the people. Did you have any opposition of anyone saying, I don't want to talk to the media, since Trump's big thing where it was a real big attack on media recently? So did you encounter anything like that?
Yes, all the time. And not just from Republicans, I'd say. Talk to people at Democratic rallies, Republican rallies, non-political events, at Selma, at polling places. And yeah, sometimes people just don't want to talk with you. What I like to do in that situation is just move on to the next person. Not some, Trump is definitely, there's a portion of it. I was at a Trump rally in Georgia in 2021, the night before the runoff election. And it's the only time someone has ever called me fake news. Like, no, I don't want to talk to you. You're fake news. But at that same rally, I had a conversation with a guy for like 20 minutes about how he felt about the election, and it was all rigged. And, he explained, obviously very Trump rally type perspective, but explained his whole thought process, what he'd been seeing, what he'd been experiencing, how he actually voted. And so you get a whole spectrum. And so I've also been at Democratic rallies where people say, I'm not comfortable talking to a journalist. And then you just move on, you find the next person. And I think that's kind of all you can do. Trump is a special factor because, I have not experienced too many of his events, but obviously there's a portion in his rallies where I don't know if he'll still do it, but at 2020, 2016, he would point to the press, at his events and say, let's all boo them, or, whatever he would say. And that kind of targeted attention is, it can be frightening, but it's definitely different. But, you can be anywhere and people won't talk to you is what I want to add to that. That's the caveat. That's a great question though. And hooray for the journalism club.
Thank you. And we have one more of our members who would love to ask a question of you.
Hi, I was wondering, how do you go about dealing with people who are very well trained and almost professional interviewees, and knowing how to work their way around not answering questions and things like that? What are some tricks of the trade that you use to get the information you're looking for from them?
That is a fantastic question. That will be a career-long question for you. My biggest tool against that is being really well prepared. So say you're interviewing someone that gets interviewed all the time and they've got their script, they've got their talking points. The best thing you can do is read all those past interviews, read and see what's been said before, so you don't ask the same kind of question. And so, well, there's two things about being prepared. So the first is not asking the same kind of question. So I'm trying to think of like a good example. But like, say you're always the person you're trying to talk to is always asked about X and they give X answer. What's the follow-up question? Like, don't even start at that first question again. What's the follow-up question, or what's another angle of that question that is not as direct? Because they're giving the same answer to that question. So, by you knowing what's been asked before, you seeing that answer repeatedly, what's your follow-up to that? The second thing in terms of preparing and kind of changing your question, I guess the biggest thing is changing the question, is by doing your research and calling other people. So say you're trying to talk to your university president, and you're trying to find out something about tuition or admission rates. Start calling the admissions office. Start, doing your reporting at another level. So you have new information or more information to go into that other interview. A colleague of mine, I forget who he said he was interviewing, some politician in Florida. He used to be Florida based. And we were actually talking about this exact same question. So that's why I say this will be a career-long question. How do you get someone off script, that good interviewee? And he found out that this politician played on the Yale baseball team. And so he called his college baseball coach to ask about him. What was his kid like on the team when he was a kid on the team? And, got some insight about what he was like in college. And then asked him about the baseball coach in his interview, and he got that opportunity. And no one is really, that's a lot of work, if you have the time to do that. But no one had asked him about that before. And so the script is gone because it's a totally new question. You've done new work and you're coming at it at a new angle, or coming at this person at a new angle. And that's like, that's kind of like the key if you have enough time to do that extra work. And so yeah, and then I find that too, once you do get people off script, usually it's because you're very well prepared and you know what's been said already. They'll tell you more information. There's kind of a respect that's built. And they won't be able to just give you the talking point because you already know it. Another tip, and I'm not as good at this, like you've got to be a more forceful interviewer than I am personally, but you can cut people off. I don't do that too often, but someone starts their, regular speech and you've heard it before, you can cut them off. I'm not as good at that. It's a little more of a more aggressive style, but sometimes you have to. I've done it a handful of times, but I'm not very good at that. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Wealth of knowledge. We really loved every bit of it. Thank you.
And again, please remember you're welcome to type your questions in the chat if you prefer not to ask yourself. I'm happy to ask for you. And does anyone else have a question right now? I guess while I have my microphone open, I guess I'd like to ask about states that do mail ballots to everyone. That is happening in a few places now, is that correct?
Yes, 5 states and California is in transition. So soon to be 6. It's if I start naming them, I might forget one, but mostly on the West Coast and Hawaii. And yeah, that's just how they do their elections. So they still have in-person voting options. Because as I address, like sometimes with disabilities or things like that, a paper ballot's not helpful. You still want those alternatives. And those states, they also have in-person on election day voting as well. But the main way is you're registered to vote, so you get sent a ballot a couple weeks, maybe a month before election day. And yeah, there are a lot of studies showing that there's no partisan advantage to mail-in voting. States where they expand it, the same number of people turn out, just some of them vote by mail. Maybe, let me say the same percentage of Democrats and Republicans turn out. The turnout overall increases marginally, but it's not been shown to sway elections in the direction of one party or another in any way. Utah is one of the states that has universal mail-in voting, and they have 2 Republican senators.
Is there any evidence at all that there's been increased fraud in states that have used that?
No, that's a really good question though. No, there's no increase in fraud either. And a lot of these states that have been doing mail-in voting for, like, it's part of the pattern now, more than 10 years, people are really comfortable and used to it. A lot of them have online portals as well, where like you can track, oh, my vote's in the mail, I'm gonna get it any day now. And then once you send it back, it's, you can see, oh, they've got it, oh, they've processed it. And so there are ways to check as well, personally, like, where is my ballot? And, if someone was voting in your name, fraudulently voting, you would be able to see that, and it could very easily be tracked and reported. But there aren't, increased instances of fraud in any way in states that have that universal mail-in voting system.
Looks like we have a question from the chat. Laura is asking, voting during COVID introduced a lot of people to mail in early absentee voting. Do you anticipate seeing consistently higher rates of voting of this voting model moving forward?
Oh yeah, definitely. Georgia is a great example of that. The number of people that voted early in person by percent, it like stayed pretty consistent from 2020 to this midterm election. Number of people voting by mail went down just a little bit, but like still a significant number. And then you got your chunk on in-person on election day. I think what you can kind of take away from that is people like having options. And people have gotten a little more settled into how they use their options. Or at least maybe opened up to, you know, what they most prefer. So yeah, I think these options are here to stay. I don't like the X factor to that is, you know, Trump and some parts of the Republican Party have been really against mail-in voting, in particular. And so I wonder if that continued language happens, will it encourage some state legislatures to change rules and you know, outlaw mail-in voting? I don't think so, but I don't know what that continued pressure could be. And then obviously, you know, there's a very big partisan divide by how people vote now because of that language. So, you know, Republicans are more likely to be the in-person on election day voters, and Democrats are more likely to be the mail-in voters. So I don't know if that changes, if the language changes, or if that hardens if the language stays the same. But yeah, I see that continuing. And then, you know, I'm from the New York City area, you know, so I think of like, I can't imagine how New York City did not have more options to vote than like 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. just on election day in the city that never sleeps. You know, how could you not vote in all these different ways at different times? So I think it's here to stay.
And while we're on the topic of mail-in voting, I'm sometimes surprised by the amount of people who don't know this, although this is not our district. Can you tell us about the 2016 election in the North Carolina 9th?
Oh my gosh, there's a whole New York Times podcast, like serial podcast series. Oh, what is it called? But it's all about that case. I don't know all the details as well, but it is a case of voter fraud that happens to have been perpetuated by Republicans in a Republican campaign. And I think it gets talked about because Republicans say, look, see, there is voter fraud, even though it was their party that did it. And then Democrats will bring it up and say, look, there was voter fraud and we caught it. And it was very easy to track and see. And we had a new election and everything was okay. So I don't know it well enough to like, you know, fully talk about all the details of it. But I would recommend that New York Times podcast if you're interested. Yeah, the North Carolina race, so close to home for you guys.
It looks like Judy in the chat is asking, what is your opinion of the Electoral College in terms of fair elections and that it will ever be dissolved?
That's a great question. I'm not going to have a satisfying answer for you for that. I apologize, just because I have not thought about it as much. That's, you know, just part of, I think, being a reporter, trying to keep my head down and not think too much about outcomes or impacts in that way. But I know people do have strong opinions on it. I'm just not one of them. Just I have not thought about it in that way. I don't think it will ever be dissolved. That's, you know, seems like something Congress would have to do, and they don't do many things like that. But there is a constitutional amendment that might be adopted if I think maybe it's like 5 more states have to sign up. So what's happened is I think they have like 15 or 20 states right now in the US that are trying to recruit more states to sign on to this constitutional amendment that says we will give our electoral college votes to whichever candidate wins the popular vote. So they don't need a majority of states to sign on, but they need enough states that equal 270, and then whatever the threshold of number is for a constitutional amendment. I forget off the top of my head. So if enough states do sign on to that it doesn't get rid of the electoral college, but it does make it obsolete, because then you have these enough states, 270, saying, who cares about the electoral college? We give our electoral college votes to the popular vote winner nationally. So that's kind of an interesting thing that could happen. Again, like I don't know how many people are aware of this. It was kind of talked about a little bit post 2016 because obviously Clinton won the popular vote, lost the electoral college. And so it was kind of re-upped a little bit. But it's been almost 6 years now, and it hasn't made it yet. In terms of it being fair, I don't know. Fair in the US democratic system is a tough question. So again, I apologize, I don't have a great answer on that, but in terms of changes, from what I understand, that constitutional amendment would be the most likely, and it's still not too popular, is my understanding.
In the chat, Sarah is asking,
Mhm.
did you notice any trends around in-person voting problems or obstacles based on populations, either if one city was prominently Republican or Democrat, or based on race or culture?
Mm. So Republican, Democrat, a little less so, except for the fact that if you're a Democrat, if you are a Democrat, you're more likely to live in an urban area, which is a more highly populated area. And then you get into those issues of like resource allocation. You can also draw other conclusion about urban areas being higher minority areas, but that's not always true. And so that's where I'd say I'd see more trends in that regard. The party is a little more coincidental just by geographical sorting. But yeah, you'll see, I think what I've noticed big picture is where there are more issues are in big cities, high populated areas where you've really got to get your resource allocation perfect, basically, to avoid lines, or have all of these options, the mail, early in person, and election day in person voting, but also like very rural areas that are more likely to be impacted by natural disasters, and then like the road, you get a rainstorm or a hurricane, the road floods, and like how do you get to the polling place because you're in such a rural area, which can also be majority minority areas. Those areas can also tend to be more Republican areas, just broadly speaking. So I'd say those are like the trends that I've noticed. But yeah, in terms of race, if you look historically, obviously it's going to be minorities. And I think you can add on top of that, and this is another protected group in the Voting Rights Act, people whose first language isn't English. And so that, that adds on to it in terms of culture. So yeah, that's what I'd say I've seen so far, but it really can be anyone, there's a very good book, by Carol Anderson. I am forgetting the name of it, all about voting rights and voter suppression. She wrote it, I want to say after the 2018 election. So it's pretty contemporary, pretty modern. And she just lays out a lot of people's stories, a lot of these anecdotes and some lawsuits around these issues. And her book kind of shows just how commonplace it is. So I'd recommend it. I think it's called One Person, No Vote, or something along those lines, but it's Carol Anderson. She's a professor at, I want to say, Emory University, or a university in Georgia.
Do you have any other questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask yourself. I guess I have one more then. I've read some of your writing in which you talk about some of the advantages of our decentralized system, that it allows us to be more responsive to the needs of the local community, and that it makes our elections more secure because it's harder to hack 50 plus systems than one system. But of course, it also has downsides in that people are voting by different rules.
Mhm.
Are there things that you have in mind that allow us to keep the benefits of our decentralized system, but allow voting to be more fair and more uniform?
All right, you've done your homework on me. I don't think I have any solutions, or any prescriptions, based on what I've seen, but I can tell you what I've seen in my reporting, what other, what legislators more powerful than me have suggested. And I'm kind of surprised that it's not been talked about as much. So going into the 2020 election, I believe it was actually Kamala Harris still in the Senate, Senator Harris proposed basically an update to the Voting Rights Act on the Senate side that didn't prescribe, a change of election laws for every state, but a federal floor of election laws. So states, after that floor of X number of days of early in person, X, for open on election day from this time to this time, kind of basic things like that. She proposed that legislation in the Senate. It didn't go anywhere. And then when 2021 started, that congressional legislation or congressional session started, there was a very big push early on with Biden as president to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Enhancement Act. And then I think it's called the For the People Act. It's HR 1 and HR 4. They passed the House. I don't think they ever made it in the Senate, but it was the same kind of idea of like adding some more floors to voting rights laws federally. So states still had that kind of nimbleness on top of that, but there would be a floor of certain things, certain criteria, certain opportunities. There were some things about voter IDs in there, allowing people to, like in HAVA, it's in the Help America Vote Act from 2001, not just show a driver's license, but, show your utility bill, show your school ID, things like that. Kind of, again, adding a floor to where the voting standards are. None of those things have happened. So I don't know if they will become a bigger push again in this next congressional session, but those are the ideas that people have had, legislators have had, that have gotten a little progress behind them, passing as of making it to legislation, and then passing in the House, at least for those House bills. But yeah, we've not done too much yet. And if you look at what the Supreme Court has done in the voting rights cases that they've heard since, there's actually been kind of a slower chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. So the floor we do currently have getting a little lower and a little lower. So that's kind of where we are. That's not really a solution. I apologize. I don't have any solutions. I just admire the problems. No solutions.
Well, as I tell my critical thinking students, we have to know what the problem is before we can solve it. In the chat, Laura's asking, have you heard about any more states pursuing ranked choice voting since last cycle?
Oh, yes. Since last cycle, New York has done it for their for their mayoral elections, New York City. So not the whole state, but just the city. And I feel like I got an email about this recently, but it's not got huge support. It's not really picked up. I think it's Alaska and Maine that do it now, if I'm remembering properly. So no, I haven't heard of any other states fully adopting it, but in the 2021 New York City, was it 2021 New York City election, or was it this year? Whenever Eric Adams won, I think it was last year, if I'm remembering right, they did it via ranked choice voting. So New York City is a pretty big place, so that's a big step. Oh yeah, I forget the name of their organization. There's a whole nonprofit that is trying to push people to adopt ranked choice voting and teach people that it's not as it might seem complicated. Oh, you have to rank the candidates, but it's not. There's a whole organization dedicated to that. I wish I could remember off the top of my head, but yeah, if you're interested in that, there are others like you.
Do we have any other questions? All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you so much, Brittany, for your time. This has been outstanding. Any last words for us?
No, I think, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks for your excellent questions. I hope I helped / answered them enough.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.